For most people, their commute to work is by car, bus or train, but for offshore workers it's by helicopter. Ever since the discovery of North Sea oil and gas in the 1960s, thousands of flights take place offshore every year. But working offshore in the North Sea is one of the most inhospitable places on the planet, and sometimes flights don't always reach their destination. This is a chronological history of North Sea aviation disasters. In the early years of North Sea operations, the Sikorsky S-61 helicopter was often the aircraft of choice. The first accident in the UK involved an S-61, operated by British Airways helicopters in November 1970. A main gearbox lubrication failure on a flight to the Staflo drilling rig ended up with the pilot ditching the plane on water. Thankfully, the 3 occupants on board were all successfully rescued after spending 2 hours in the aircraft life raft. The first fatality occurred on 9th of July 1973 in the Norwegian sector, again involving an S-61, when a helicopter service flight returning from the Ekofisk field crashed into the sea, overturned and sank. 10 survivors managed to get into the helicopter's life raft and were later picked up by a passing vessel, but 3 survivors who couldn't get to the raft spent the next 2 hours perilously perched on the upturned aircraft before finally being rescued by a search and rescue helicopter. Unfortunately, 4 other workers weren't so lucky and perished. Helicopters from this era didn't have black boxes, which are actually orange to help find them, so no flight data was available to help establish the cause of the accident. Our next accident happened in March 1976 during a flight back from the West Sole gas field in the British sector of the southern North Sea. A cover on the engine air intake on a Western Wessex chopper operated by Bristow helicopters became loose and was sucked into the air intake, stopping both the engines. The aircraft made a controlled landing on the sea, and thankfully all 14 people on board were successfully rescued. The first fatal accident in the British sector occurred on 21st of April 1976, when a shuttle flight between BP's Forties Bravo and Forties Charlie platforms crashed on approach to the Charlie helideck. The Sikorsky S-58 helicopter involved suffered a tail rotor failure whilst trying to land, crashed onto the helideck and then toppled over the side onto the deck of a barge which was moored alongside the platform. 1 person was killed in the accident, but 9 people were successfully rescued, largely due to the prompt efforts of crew on the barge and platform. Another S-61 incident happened in 1977 when a flight from the Venture 2 drilling rig to Aberdeen Airport ditched on water after suffering severe engine vibration, but all 3 occupants were rescued. Our next 2 accidents take us back to Norway and again involved the S-61, both operated by helicopter service. The Ekofisk platform was involved for a second time when a flight to the platform on 23rd of November 1977 crashed into the sea, killing all 12 on board. The cause was never identified. This was followed just 7 months later, on 26th of June 1978, when a flight to the Statfjord A platform also crashed into the sea, with all 18 occupants perishing. The cause of this accident was due to a fatigue crack on a joint which loosened one of the rotor blades. 2 major fatal accidents in such a short space of time, the worst in the North Sea up to this point, led to an extensive inquiry in Norway into helicopter safety, which significantly improved Norway's safety record after that. There wasn't another fatal accident in the country for another 19 years. But when there was, there were far-reaching consequences for the offshore industry. But we'll get onto that later on in the video. One finding from the inquiry related to the use of survival suits. Up until this time, the wearing of survival suits wasn't mandatory, but after these accidents, as well as the loss of the Alexander Keeland installation in 1980, which also claimed 123 lives, survival suits became mandatory in Norway. 3 accidents in the UK in the space of a year, all operated by Bristows, led to a similar inquiry in the UK. The first, on 12th of August 1981, occurred during a transfer flight between the Brent Bravo and Norne Alpha platforms, both operated by Shell. A Bell 212 helicopter ditched on the water when the pilot became disorientated. The pilot was flying on his own, with no co-pilot, and none of the passengers were wearing survival suits. They were mandatory by Shell on flights to the installations, but not for transfers between platforms. The inquiry that later followed recommended that co-pilots should be used, and that survival suits should be made mandatory for all flights, following the lead from Norway. Just one day later, on 13th of August, a flight back from another Shell installation, Leman in the southern North Sea, crashed into the sea. The 13 occupants of the Westland Wessex aircraft all died in the accident, the cause of which was never identified. And 1 year later, in September 1982, another Bell 212 chopper crashed whilst transporting 6 aircrew between the Treasure Finder floating accommodation unit and the Baffin Seal seismic survey vessel. Again, the causes of the accident were unknown. But despite the UK inquiry, the accidents kept on coming. In March 1983, an S-61 flight back from the Claymore installation ditched on water following a main rotor gearbox failure, with all 17 occupants rescued. May 1984 saw an accident involving the largest helicopter to be used offshore in the North Sea, a Boeing Chinook helicopter. The flight, operated by British Airways helicopters, ditched at sea on the way back from the Magnus field following a flying control system malfunction. All 47 occupants were rescued. Just 6 months later, a Bristow-operated Bell 212 aircraft crashed into the sea on the way back from the Cecile Provine drilling rig, killing the pilot and flight attendant, but thankfully no other passengers were on board. Yet again, no cause was identified for the accident, and the AAIB report into the crash recommended that flight data recorders should be fitted to aircraft as soon as possible. We have a new helicopter in our history for the next accident, a Bell 214 operated by British Caledonian Helicopters. It was on its way back from the Magnus field in May 1986 when the aircraft ditched on water after a failure of a locking plate on the collective control hub, but all 20 occupants were rescued by a nearby fishing vessel. We're halfway through our history of accidents, and the next one is a biggie, and still the worst offshore helicopter accident to have happened in the world. But before we go on, please like and subscribe if you are enjoying this video. On 6th of November 1986, a Chinook helicopter was flying back to Sunborough Airport on the Shetland Islands from the Brent field. The flight was operated by British International Helicopters, which was previously British Airways Helicopters but had been privatised just 2 months earlier. The aircraft was 2.5 miles from Sunborough Airport on its approach when disaster happened. The twin-rotor design of the Chinook required careful synchronisation between the blades, but a catastrophic forward transmission failure occurred, causing the 2 tandem rotor blades to collide. The aircraft crashed into the sea, killing 45 of its 47 occupants. Miraculously, 2 persons survived the accident. The Air Accident Investigation Branch later attributed the accident to a modified bevel ring gear in the transmission, which had not undergone enough testing before being certified for use. After this accident, the offshore industry decided that the Chinook helicopters were too large for offshore operations, and they were never to be seen again in the North Sea. 1988 saw 2 more accidents involving the S-61 helicopter, which both ditched on the water with all occupants being successfully rescued. The first was transporting workers home from the safe Fellicia flotel working in the Forties field, when a fire in the main gearbox led to the ditching. 4 months later, a fatigue failure of the transmission gear affected a flight on the way back from the Sedco 703 drilling rig. Then in July 1990, a flight to the Brent Spar installation ended in disaster. Yet another S-61 was attempting to land on the helideck when the pilots navigated too close to a crane, and a rotor hit a handrail. The helicopter crashed onto the platform before toppling into the sea. 7 workers survived, but unfortunately 6 people died. Our next crash starts a series of accidents affecting a model of helicopter that eventually became to be known by offshore crews as the Flying Coffin, the Eurocopter Super Puma. A flight from the Cormorant Alpha platform to the Safe Supporter flotel in March 1992 crashed into the sea 500 metres from the Alpha platform. 11 people were killed in the crash, with 6 survivors. The cause of the accident was later attributed to human error, possibly caused by fatigue from flying long hours. Another Super Puma accident en route to the Brae Alpha platform in 1995 was caused by a lightning strike to the tail rotor, and the aircraft ditched on water. All 18 of the occupants escaped. 19 years after the last fatal accident in Norwegian waters, the Super Puma was involved in a fatal accident in September 1997. A flight from Brønnøy to the Norne FPSO installation crashed into the sea, killing all 12 on board, after cracking in an engine shaft on the aircraft. This was the first fatal accident in the North Sea for a Super Puma caused by a technical failure, but it wouldn't be the last, as we will see later. In 2001, a CHC Super Puma fell over whilst on the helideck of the West Navion drillship, which was caused by excessive vessel motions. Whilst on the helideck, helicopter rotors continued to rotate, and as it fell over, the blade splintered apart, spraying debris across the helideck. The co-pilot, who was outside the aircraft conducting checks, was hit in one leg by the flying debris, but miraculously escaped with his life. Let's jump forward to July 2002 and another new helicopter model in our list, this time the Sikorsky S-76. Whilst on a flight from the Clipper installation to the GSF Monarch drilling rig, the helicopter suffered a blade failure and crashed into the sea, killing all 11 on board. The cause was later attributed to a previous lightning strike on the blade 3 years earlier, which introduced a defect into the blade that went unnoticed. Our next accident isn't strictly speaking in the North Sea. It happened during a flight between the Milham West and North Morecambe platforms in Morecambe Bay to the west of Great Britain. A Dolphin 2 helicopter operated by CHC was inbound to the North Morecambe installation in bad weather when the pilot became disorientated and crashed into the sea, with the loss of all 7 occupants. February 2009, and a Super Puma flight is on its way between Aberdeen and the BP ETAP platform. This aircraft was a newer version of the Super Puma, the EC225 version, and was operated by Bond. Both pilots were disorientated on the approach to the platform in darkness, and the aircraft ended up hitting the water instead of landing on the ETAP platform. Thankfully, all 18 occupants escaped before the aircraft capsized in the water. 2 months later, and another Mark II Super Puma had just left the Miller platform on its way back to Aberdeen Airport. A catastrophic main rotor gearbox failure, initiated by a fatigue fracture in the epicyclic gearbox, led to separation of the main rotor from the gearbox. The craft plummeted like a stone into the sea, killing all 16 people on board. Following this tragedy, 2 further Super Puma accidents happened in quick succession in 2012, thankfully without any casualties. In May, a 225 variant ditched whilst en route to the Maersk Resilient drilling rig, and in October another 225 ditched on the way to the West Phoenix rig. Both accidents were attributed to the same cause: fracture of a gear in the gearbox again. Understandably, offshore workers were starting to get worried about this trend. A further accident happened a year later on 23rd of August 2013 involving a Mark II Super Puma. A flight from the Borgsten Dolphin drilling rig was inbound to Sumba Airport on the Shetland Islands when it crashed into the sea. The aircraft immediately capsized, but 14 people were able to escape from the upturned chopper. Unfortunately, 4 occupants didn't survive. The cause was later attributed to pilot error. The accident was the last accident to have occurred in the British sector, and we've now had 10 years without a further accident in the UK. But we still have one more accident to go to conclude our history. On 29th of April 2016 in the Norwegian sector, a Super Puma 225 flight was on its way back from the Gullfaks B platform when disaster struck. As it flew over the islet of Skitholmen between the islands of Turoy and Toftoy, the craft suffered a catastrophic gearbox failure, leading to loss of the rotor blades. The fall of the rotor blades was captured on camera by eyewitnesses, and the main fuselage crashed on the edge of the islet, then slipped into the sea. all 13 people on board were killed. The Super Puma was immediately grounded by the aviation authorities, making life difficult for offshore operators, as the Super Puma had become the dominant aircraft used by the industry. Getting workers offshore became very difficult until more airframes of different models were sourced. The aircraft was grounded for a whole year before it was recertified for use in 2017 by the authorities, after changes to the design and maintenance of the gearbox. But by now it was too late. The aircraft's reputation lay in tatters, with the offshore unions calling it the flying coffin. Workers made it very clear that they would refuse to fly in the Super Puma, and the aircraft has never returned to use in the North Sea again, despite being used elsewhere in the world. And that is the last entry in our history of tragic North Sea helicopter accidents, bringing the total lives lost to a distressing 182 fatalities. This video is dedicated to the memories of all those who have died in this wild frontier. Thank you very much for watching, and please leave any comments below on what other subjects you would like me to cover in future videos.